Starting us off like we always do, with number 10, we have sodomy. This is a very common thing that occurs in prisons all over the world. A lot of inmates are abused on a daily basis by other aggressive inmates or prison gangs that are trying to gain power and control. There are even some cases of prison guards abusing their authority and sodomizing the inmates. This is a cruel and unforgivable form of punishment that actually occurs a lot more than you guys would think. Hog tying and other forms of physical torture makes its way into number 9 on this list. Hog tying, what the heck is that? Well, hog tying looks like this. Your wrists and ankles are tied together. This is extremely uncomfortable, and many times prisoners are left like this for hours. There are even situations where mentally ill patients would be tied up like this and they would just be naked, denied water and food for hours. There are also left to stand, sit, or lie naked in their own feces or urine, and they are denied shower privileges for days. Number 8 brings us to force-fed drugs. There was a very controversial and highly secretive government program that basically revolves around trying to control people's minds. The scientists involved with this program decided it would be a good idea to test the effects of LSD on unsuspecting prison inmates because they figured no one cares what happened to the inmates anyway, so why not? So they gave the LSD to inmates and they would fight back and they wouldn't tell them what the drug was. In one case, a mentally ill patient was doped with LSD for 174 straight days. Neutral loaf comes into number 7. We've all heard that prison food is terrible, but this is arguably one of the most disturbing food that has ever been given to another human being. I mean, this is basically the worst thing that prison can legally give the prisoners without it constituting as abuse. Sure, it has all the nutrients that your body needs to survive, but apparently it's super disgusting. The prisoners get to choose between a week of Nutriloaf meals or spend a week in solitary confinement. Most of them pick solitary confinement. Next up, number 6, we have almost beaten to death. There have been many reports of prisoners being drastically abused by the prison guards almost to the point that they are unrecognizable. Sometimes there are corrupt correctional officers that will allow gangs or other inmates to beat each other almost to the point of death, or they'll take the prisoners away from the cameras and they'll do it themselves. Solitary confinement makes its way into number 5 on this list. This is probably the worst form of psychological torture. No one wants to be sent to the hole. Prisoners in solitary confinement spend 22 to 24 hours a day in a small cell with barely any human contact. Many inmates spend years or even decades cut off from any real social interactions. This extreme isolation can permanently affect their emotional and mental health. They quickly become paranoid and more prone to violence and hallucinations. Albert Woodfox spent 43 years in solitary confinement, so I guess you could say that he was tortured for over 4 decades. I mean, is this real life right now? Number 4 brings us to white noise torture. This is the sound that you get when you don't tune your device to the correct channel. Here's a little sample of that. This is probably one of the most annoying sounds in the world, so just imagine if you were forced to listen to this for long periods of time. I mean, no, I couldn't imagine this. You'd probably go insane and you'd be so sleep deprived. Tiger cages are at number 3. This cruel and unusual form of punishment is absolutely terrifying. Some prisons will use tiger cages for punishing the prisoners. These cages are made out of barbed wires and they have just enough space for the prisoners to lay or sit down inside of. In these cages, the prison guards will torment the prisoner by pouring cold water on them at night, pouring salt water into or lighting a fire near the tiger's cages during hot days. Number 2 takes us to cancer injections. Back in the 1950s, scientists wanted to inject prisoners with cancer to study how their bodies would react. Even though all of the prisoners were volunteers, I'm sure they weren't told how dangerous and how life-threatening this experiment would be. They were probably told that they would get time reduced off of their sentence or, compensated in one way or another. Either way, this is a very immoral and highly unethical. Finally, number 1, we have being left to die. I mean, of course we left this to number 1. Sometimes when a criminal commits an extremely awful crime, there are certain police officers that try to take justice into their own hands. There was a case of one man named Adolph Archie who shot and murdered a police officer. Well, he was in need of medical attention himself because he had been shot, but instead of sending him to the hospital, hospital, they brought him to jail, and within a few hours he was dead. All of his teeth were shattered, his skull was fractured, and he had severe hemorrhaging in his testicles. So he had been beaten to death by an angry mob of police officers, and I bet this wasn't the first time that something like this has happened.
Starting off this countdown, we have Berserker. Between the 8th to mid 11th century, the Vikings were known to be very aggressive. In fact, when they were at battle, they would go into this trance-like state that was called Berserker. Once in this state, they would violently kill anyone who got in their way. Well, theory goes that this state was actually caused by eating magic mushrooms. Apparently, the mushrooms that grew in their area would cause hallucinations and would also increase their adrenaline levels, hence why they act so violently and out of control. Like nowadays, people do shrooms and just chill out and watch Dora the Explorer. Imagine doing a whole battle while tripping out. In our 9th spot, we have the burning bodies. But before I go any further, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up because it really helped us out. In Norse religion, after death, it was said that warriors went into these great realms. But in order to get there, they needed a vessel. So when someone died back then, Vikings would place their body on a boat and push them off to sea. These boats were often surrounded by weapons and goods, even sometimes human sacrifices, all to help them get to their end destination. Not only that, but the more wealthy Vikings would actually burn the boat with the deceased on them and then push them out to sea. That's a pretty creepy image if you ask me, just watching a flaming dead body. Or bodies. In our 8th spot, we have the imbalance. Turns out that the Vikings were killing off so many women that they started having an uneven gender ratio. This was because men were considered stronger than women. Also because the Norse values sons more than daughters. Over the years, archaeologists found tons of young female skeletons, so it was believed that they would get rid of them when they were young. Coming in at number 7, we have the teeth. Back in the day, Vikings would painfully file and dye their teeth. Archaeologists recently unearthed evidence of this. Basically, they would file their teeth down. Some would file horizontal parallel lines in their front 2 teeth, and some even dyed them. Often red. Yeah, not white, red. And then the dye would seep into the carvings and stand out. Doesn't this kind of remind you of something? Yeah, everything is coming full circle. Remember that whole trend on TikTok of people filing down their own teeth by themselves? Wow. Now the purpose of this filing remains unclear, but some think it may have to do with their status as a great fighter. Other people believe that it was done to scare off their enemies. In our 6th spot, we have the bloody soup. This was a practice that women would use when caring for an injured Viking. It was used to gauge how bad their flesh wounds were. So basically, they would make a broth out of onions, leeks, and herbs. Then they would feed this to the injured Viking. After he finished eating it, they would then smell the wound. Yes, smell the wound. If they could smell the soup, then they knew the wound was way too deep and there was no sense helping the warrior. They would just die soon anyways. But if there was no smell, then good on them. The dude was good and they would actually treat them. Isn't that insane? Imagine if hospitals made us do that, like down a crap ton of onions and then sniff us. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the blood tasting. This is another really weird practice that the Vikings would do. So basically, women would use the blood of a wound to figure out more about the injury. They would do this by tasting the blood. I mean, there's not much information on this practice, but still, it's quite gross, but also kind of fascinating. Like, how could they tell the difference between a fatal wound and a non-fatal wound just by tasting someone's blood? Totally blows my mind. Again, thankfully this isn't a practice doctors and nurses use today. Moving on at number 4, we have an eye for an eye. The Vikings had a pretty messed up justice system. Thank gosh, it's not like this still. But basically, killing someone wasn't always illegal. For example, they believed in an eye for an eye. So if someone, let's say, killed your wife, you could then kill the murderer. But then it would get complicated because then the murderer's family could kill you and then it would just be this like perpetual killing cycle. They also had a thing called home gangs, which which was a way of settling disputes. Basically, these were fights to the death. If one person did you wrong, you could ask them to a duel. If the person who was challenged doesn't show up, then they were deemed guilty, and anyone was allowed to kill that person. Again, I'm glad this isn't a thing anymore. In our third spot, we have the games. Obviously, they weren't playing jump rope or hopscotch for fun. No, they had some pretty dark games, like a swimming competition, except you're not swimming. In fact, you would hold your opponent underwater for as long as you could. If the man didn't resurface, then you won, and the dude died. So basically they were playing murder. Moving on to number 2, we have the human sacrifices. For a number of years, scientists believed Vikings did not partake in human sacrifice. That was until 1990, when an archaeologist made a quite interesting discovery. While using a metal detector, the archaeologist found jewelry and weapons along the edge of a lake. He kept digging and eventually came across evidence of human sacrifice that dated back to the Viking Age. Then in the 1930s, a series of ancient wells were excavated. That's when they found bone remnants of 5 people. Again, suggesting this. According to Vikings, sacrifices helped re-establish their connection to the gods, and they would only do this when things were going bad for them. And in our number 1 spot, we have the blood eagle. Now this one is fairly graphic. Blood eagle is a method of ritual execution. Basically, the victim would be restrained, their face down. Then the shape of an eagle with its wings out would be carved into their back. And then their ribs would be cut off, one by one. Finally, they would take the skin and pull it apart to make it look like a pair of wings. Ever seen the show Hannibal? It reminds me of that one episode from season 1. If you know, you know. But it gets worse. You would still be alive while all of this happened. And then a saline solution would be poured all over your body. Okay, I can barely take hand sanitizer in a paper cut, so that would be brutal. The last step was taking the victim's lungs and spreading them over the wings. Starting off this countdown, we have the discipline. So the poor Roman warriors were disciplined through fear. If they were a coward in battle or were slacking while on duty, they would be stoned. Some would survive, others wouldn't. Even if they committed minor offenses, they would receive severe punishment. So basically, they were living in fear. They would always have to act strong and courageous, or else they would be severely injured. In fact, whips were often common at Roman military camps. Another cruel punishment would be slowly breaking the soldiers' ribs one by one. That is incredibly cruel and painful. They lost a lot of their warriors from these punishments. In our 9th spot, we have the mouthwash. And if you guys are liking this video so far, make sure to give it a big thumbs up. Also, if you want to see a Q&A, then make sure to go check out Most Amazing Elite, because right after this video, I'm doing a little Q&A answering your burning questions. So back in ancient Rome, urine was considered valuable. Sounds crazy and disgusting, I know. But they had people whose job was to go around collecting pee from public urinals, or they would go door to door asking people to do their business in a vat. Why? Well, they use this fluid for a lot of stuff. They would clean their clothes in it, and it's also how they clean their teeth. I know. They used to use pee as mouthwash. I want to just gag thinking about it. But according to them, they thought it was a way to keep their teeth pearly and clean. Can you imagine? No. And like other people's pee? No. Anyway, sorry. Moving on to number 8, we have the communal sponge. If you thought that point was bad, wait till you hear this one. So the public toilets in ancient Rome were absolutely disgusting. Sure, they had a pretty advanced sewer system for their time, but believe me, it wasn't pretty. In fact, it was said that it was hardly ever cleaned, if even at all. These toilets were shared with dozens of other people, but you were given one sponge on a stick. That sponge was used to wipe your behind. The sponge was never cleaned. So everyone was just sharing that dirty sponge wiper. I told you this point was gonna be bad. I just feel dirty talking about it. I need to go home and take a shower or something. Like other people on your bum. It's disgusting. In our 7th spot, we have the warrior blood. So apparently when a Roman gladiator or warrior lost their life, their blood was collected and then sold as medicine. The Romans believed that the warrior's blood had magical powers to it, and that it could cure epilepsy or diseases. That wasn't all though. They also would take out the warrior's liver and eat them raw. Again, for similar reasons. What's crazy is that it might have actually worked. Some Roman physicians reported that people that drank blood would actually be cured from their seizures. Even if that's the case, we aren't vampires, okay? Like, I'm not too keen on blood drinking. Moving on, at number 6, we have the dead skin cells. I honestly don't know what the Romans were thinking, but basically back then soap was a rare commodity. So warriors and athletes would clean themselves by covering themselves in oil and then scraping the dead skin cells off their body with this special tool. Okay, I get it, like they like to exfoliate and that's creative, I guess. But then they would save their sweat and skin scrapings and put it into a bottle. Then this was sold to women and it was considered an aphrodisiac. Ew, just ew. But wait, it gets worse. The woman would then take this skin and sweat and rub it all over their face. Like a face cream. They thought it would make them irresistible to men. Like, ew, imagine if that was still a thing nowadays. Any woman that did that would be considered a psychopath or something. We're now in our 5th and halfway mark with the cowards. Back then, warriors were super strict. They had no tolerance for cowards at all. In fact, they had very cruel punishments for people that would chicken out during battle. If you were deemed a coward, basically you were ridiculed, and then it would be hard to find a woman to marry. One of their punishments would be to go around wearing cloaks with patches of dyed cloth, looking untidy with only half of your beard shaved. Half. It was weird. This was considered a cruel and embarrassing punishment. But believe me, it's way better than some of the other punishments that they would go through. More on this shortly. Moving on to number 4, we have death first. Roman warriors did not take loss for an answer. It was either they win or they die trying. Literally. To them, if they were ever in a position where they had to surrender or were defeated, they were expected to take their own lives. To them, they rather die than surrender or lose, which was considered a huge disgrace. In our 3rd spot, we have the GOAT energy drink. Nowadays, if people want a huge pick-me-up, they turn to Red Bull or Monsters. Well, back then, obviously they didn't have access to those drinks, but they did have access to a different kind of energy drink, one made from goat. So warriors that needed an energy boost would eat goat dung. Apparently, it gave them a good little pick-me-up. Actually, rumor has it that Emperor Nero loved to drink it. But that wasn't the only thing the dung was used for. They would use it as a makeshift band-aid to patch up their wounds. During the spring, they collected a bunch of it and then would dry it out. And ta-da! A band-aid. In emergencies though, they would just plop on fresh poo. In our 2nd spot, we have decimation. One of the most brutal punishments the Roman warriors went through was something called decimation. Basically, a bunch of guilty men would be divided into groups of 10. From there, they would draw straws. The one who drew the shortest straw would be killed by the other 9 men. So basically, it was all left to chance. You better be extremely lucky or else. They did this because they couldn't afford to kill off a bunch of warriors, so instead they just killed one off brutally to scare the other men. Now, decimation was around until the reign of Emperor Diocletian, which was 284 to 305 AD. And in our number 1 spot, we have punishment of the sack. This was another brutal form of punishment. Basically, the wrongdoer would have their head covered by a sack made from wolf skin. Their feet would then be covered in wooden shoes. From there, they would be beaten with rods. Not only that, but for the most part, the wrongdoer would be placed in the sack with other animals in it, like snakes or monkeys, and then it was sewn shut. Then the sack was dragged into the sea or river. So not only would they suffer from drowning, but they would be bit and scratched while on the way down. But this punishment was only saved for people that did the worst of the worst crimes, especially parricide, the killing of a parent or near relative. That was considered a sign of extreme ungratefulness and disrespect, something the Romans took very seriously.